receive participants from all over the world: Malaysia, Iran, UK, Germany, South Africa, America, and all over India, from people from all stages and spaces of their analytic journey. We welcome you all. It is our privilege to host this conversation with Professor Sudhir Kakar, an esteemed pioneer who needs no introduction, but we certainly and humbly will offer him one, who has brought a distinct Indian flavor to the global psychoanalytic discourse through his prolific oeuvre of academic and literary contributions, spanning across more than 4 decades.
We convene under shades, which is a space for becoming as much as it is one for psychoanalysis. It intends to foster a community of minds and hearts that may grow together in their passion for psychoanalytic being and in their journeys of self-knowledge, healing, and creativity. Under its canopy, we organize study groups, supervision circles, creativity hubs, and conversations with psychoanalytic thinkers from all avenues and schools of thought.
Today, we have the pleasure of inviting Professor Kakar to talk with us about Mind in the World, which is the title of an upcoming volume of his authorship, as well as a subject that seems to open the door for many questions we hope to engage with as students, trainees, and clinicians, peculiar keepers and witnesses of the psyche in a world that has survived tectonic shifts in the last couple of years. Perhaps these have been most explicitly and extraneously traceable from 2019, as though a collective attunement towards or instinct for destruction has finally come charging through the depths of the unthought known. Cracking through the crust of a thinkable world, then it could be said that sharpening political division, community violence, a pandemic, and war seem to have become deepening fissures along fault lines, carving a map for a psychic reality that must have been waiting to be born and to be born. But we have guidance in this task of bearing births and rebirths, coming through catastrophes. Others that have lived and died before us have much to teach us about survival. We have with us, for one, the writings of Freud, to which we shall turn today on his birthday, as he contemplated war, death, mourning, melancholia, transience, and transcendence in his own time of collective catastrophe and personal grief. We thank Professor Kakar for aiding us to rediscover Freud in our strivings towards aliveness, towards finding our place in a world that has somehow survived concentrated destruction. A pandemic can be deadly and deadening. Dead ends of space, time, and circumstances, however, don't have to mean it's the end of meandering or that our journeys have been lost too. It's something we may learn from Professor Kakar's reflections on his own encounters with such dead ends. Perhaps in times like these, we need our gurus to show up as spirits of shared kinship, a kinship of shared experience. As a young man searching for himself in the world, he met Erickson, a guru whose own familiarity with meandering, self-searching, and dead ends seemed to have given Professor Kakar the heart to take on his own authentic journey towards psychoanalysis.
Professor Sudhir Kakar was born in quaint Nainital, a hill station in the state of Uttarakhand in India. His academic journey, much like his life, took him through several deviations from the main road, as he writes in his autobiography, A Book of Memory. For those of us who have known the thrill and despair of wandering, it is nothing short of inspiring, or at least reassuring, to hear him describe these explorations into marvelous, unexpected vistas. He began his intermediate studies at Maharaja's College, Jaipur in 1953. Later, he acquired a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Gujarat University, and then traveling all the way to Germany, he earned a master's in business administration from University of Mannheim. After a spell in what he disarmingly terms as a psychosocial moratorium, and from which he emerged with a newfound friend and teacher in Erickson, he completed a fast-track doctoral program in economics at the University of Vienna, finishing at the starting line of his psychoanalytic training at the University of Frankfurt's Sigmund Freud Institute. The diverse spaces and disciplines eventually bring him to where we found him, and he's found us. and we are all carried in his work as an author, a thinker, a psychoanalyst, a professor. Such diversity in being and in praxis coming together through a life lived across continents, across disciplines. Wonder what that's like. In 1975, he returned to Delhi to set up his psychoanalytic practice and also served as the head of Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at Indian Institute of Technology. He has been a senior fellow at the Center for Study of World Religions at Harvard, a visiting professor at the universities of Chicago, McGill, Melbourne, Hawaii, Vienna, and France. He has also been a fellow at the Institute of Advanced Study Princeton, Institute of Advanced Study Berlin, and Center for Advanced Study of Humanities, University of Cologne. He has been honored with multiple awards for his incomparable contributions. The Order of Merit by the Federal Republic of Germany, the Distinguished Service Awards by the Indo-American Psychiatric Association, and Abraham Gardner Award at Columbia University, to name just a few. He has been profiled as one of the 25 major thinkers of the world by the French weekly Le Nouveau Observateur, and one of the 21 thinkers of the 21st century by the German weekly Die Zeit. He currently lives, practices, and teaches in Goa, the holiday haven of India, perhaps an ideal retreat for someone whose work is given to fiery forays into unexplored and sometimes provocative spaces of discourse. Through his writings, he has sponsored a vivacious cross-pollination between mysticism, spirituality, sexuality, culture, mythology, and psychoanalysis, all the while informed by his keen curiosity and attunement to the question of Indianness and what it lends to such a looking glass pointed toward the mind in the world. And with that, we humbly and gratefully invite Professor Kakar to share with us his most recent reactions of the subject. Professor Kakar, psychoanalysis affords us a special license to allow our thinking to transcend the limitations of time. As a writer of fiction, can you imagine a conversation on Freud's birthday? You know, Kakar from 2022 and Freud from 1914. How will that look or sound? We ask this with the curiosity of young children wanting to learn what fascinating things elders are talking about.
Thank you, Apshita, and thank you, Gagan, for inviting me not only to this event, but also giving me a chance to have a conversation which I've always wanted to have. And now today I can have with Sigmund Freud in imagination. I'll do it as a real conversation, although I don't think I can, Freud's German inflected English, I won't be able to do that. So I'll start with myself. So Professor, may I call you Professor, as the first generation of analysts at your Wednesday meetings on psychoanalysis in Vienna in the first decades of the last century, and some of your patients did? Freud. You may, Herr Kakar. If I address you as Herr, it is because as a European of a certain class, and unlike the Americans, I was always a formal person in my professional and social interactions. And after all, psychoanalytically, you are my great-grandson, since your own mentor was analyzed by my daughter, Anna. Myself now, thank you, Professor. I'm happy about that connection, though as an Indian, I wish you were less irritated with Indian psychoanalysts or even Indians generally. On the whole, I think my Indian students have reacted in the least satisfactory way to my teaching. You once said to your patient, the poet Hilda Doolittle, and on another occasion that, quote you, the Hindu was all muddled with unconscious and with psychoanalysis in general. The writer Mulkraj Anand, who went to see you for a few sessions in Vienna as a young man, told me that you once burst out mid-session, you Indians with your eternal mother complex. There are so many things I'd like to ask you about, Professor, but with the time being short, I will limit myself to what you may have to say on two issues. The first is the universalist aspiration you had for psychoanalysis, your unquestioned assumption of a psychic unity of humankind. The second, on the number of schools that have proliferated in psychoanalysis since you laid the foundations of the discipline. But first, the question of universality. For a long time, psychoanalysis minimized how its theories remain culture-bound and how they were derived from and tested mostly with middle-class European and US populations. Yet even in these societies, globalization and social changes, such as the sharp increase in multiculturalism, have been resulting in more and more calls from analysts of varying persuasion in many different countries to re-examine the issue of culture in psychoanalysis and not shy away from any reculturalization if found necessary. The challenge to which many analysts have been responding, and I wish there were many more from non-Western societies, is how to retain our unique commitment to a deep exploration of subjectivity while recognizing how culture is a powerful shaper of this subjectivity. That the mind is constructed, or at least profoundly shaped, by the linguistic and cultural milieu in which it develops. That human psyche or the individual self is a system of reverberating representational worlds, conscious and unconscious mental representations of culture, primary family relationships, and bodily life, each enriching, constraining, and shaping the others as they jointly evolve through the life cycle. Freud. Herr Kakar, my world was still that of colonial Europe, which regarded itself as the center of the world, culturally, intellectually, politically. It was untouched by the globalization and decolonization of your times. The relativism of postmodern thought, such as Foucault's powerful argument on the rootedness of all thought in history and culture, still lay more than half a century in the future. I can understand that adherents of this perspective are not a priori willing to accept why psychoanalysis, a product of 19th century European bourgeois family and social structure, should be an exception to the general rule on the incapacity of thought to transcend its roots. I have no hesitation to accept that I discovered only what European thought of my time allowed me to discover. But I was always ready to change my psychoanalytic theories in light of new information and understanding, something not all my followers were or are willing to do. Very near the beginning of the ego and the id, one of my most important essays on psychoanalysis, whose 100th anniversary is next year, I say, if I may quote myself, Herr Kakar, if psychoanalysis has not hitherto shown its appreciation of certain things, this has never been because it overlooked their achievement or sought to deny their importance, but because it followed a particular path which had not yet led so far. And Herr Kakar, I hope you are aware that your own project on psychoanalysis and non-Western culture is also rooted in the continuing historical process of mental decolonization of erstwhile colonized peoples that began to gather pace only after the colonial period has intended. Myself. Professor, I know you will not be offended if I question some of your theories and models, because you are always willing to criticize and replace them yourself. Professor, I've always wondered what you think of the many schools of psychoanalysis that have proliferated after your death. The French analyst André Green categorizes the school from the perspective of a broad geographic distribution, Europe and the USA, giving, and I quote him, rise to groupings of analytic movements which did not escape the identifying stamp. One identified with an empirical, clinical discourse in which there was a desire to cure, where psychoanalysis was presented from a therapeutic perspective, that is psychoanalysis a la North America. The other was a structured and cultural psychoanalysis with hermeneutic reference, with a Lacanian hint and an overriding problematic scenario of symbolic order as the basis of subjectivity, that is French psychoanalysis. Within this broad grouping, of course, there are a number of other psychoanalytic schools. We can keep on listing them: British post-Freudian, British Kleinians, French neo-Freudians, French Lacanians, American ego psychologists, American self-psychologists, American intersubjectivists, American relationists, and so on. Of course, individual analysts or even groups of analysts in different countries may belong to one or the other school without sharing the national geographical designation that identifies these schools. Freud. His answer, Herr Kakar, I'm sanguine about this proliferation. I was never interested in psychoanalysis becoming a cult with only one set of beliefs on what constitutes the psyche, the nature of the unconscious, and only one right way to approach it. I was always aware of the vast mysteries of the human mind and that human beings never really fit into our paradigms or our models. The many schools in psychoanalysis are like the blind man and the elephant in the fable from your country, where each touches one part of the elephant, the side, the trunk, the leg, the tail, and so on, and then proclaims it to be the whole beast. As long as each school is aware that it has only illuminated one part of the mind and does not have the hubris of equating it with the whole, we should welcome even more schools. Of course, also being on guard that the blind man is only touching the elephant and not an ox that has accidentally wandered onto the site. But perhaps more important, identifying with the tenets of a particular school, Lacanian, Kleinian, Bionian, Kohutian, and others, gives a young analyst confidence to embark on the clinical journey that so many members of her school have undertaken before her. A map, however partial and limited to one particular area of the territory, still gives a feeling of security to the explorer. With experience, I hope the analyst will develop her own style, one that feels most comfortable for her. As you know, very often I was not a Freudian in the sense of myself following the recommendations I have given for clinicians. Thank you, Herr Professor. The next question you can come to. Hello?
Yes, sir. Gagan, you're on mute. Okay, Professor, I think this would be a good point to introduce a question by a participant. Professor Barrett is here with us, and I'd like to invite him to ask his question if he'd be so gracious.
Could we do it as you had suggested, that the questions from the audience come afterwards, so that that our conversation first on these matters which we are talking of doesn't get a break in between, because then the thread gets broken.
That would also be okay, sir.
Yeah, if that is okay, and if she excuses me, the questionnaire, that I take it up after. I don't want the thread to be broken because, for instance, from the different schools, what you wanted to ask, I think, the question of different therapeutic styles. So what are the kind of thing that would get then broken?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Gagan, would you like to?
Yeah, so like you yourself mentioned, Professor Kakar, that if you could share some reflections on the psychoanalytic method and therapeutic style in its variations, and how we can read Freud and Bose to cultivate the clinician's mind in the world of 2022.
Well, since the primary focus of psychoanalysis is on the unconscious, where knowledge, logic, and reason are essentially considered as secondary elements of mental life, the therapeutic style of an analyst is dictated by what she believes: first, what is the nature of the unconscious, and second, what is the best way of providing the patient an access to the unconscious. The method, listening, is common to all schools. The differences lie in how the analyst should act, the technique she should use to facilitate the client's access to the unconscious. But first, the nature of the unconscious. Within the Freudian tradition, I'm not considering the Jungian one, with a very different view of the contents of the unconscious, an analyst usually proceeds to play the raga as taught by her gharana, although there may be some masters who extend and innovate on the musical training they have received. Bose's view of the unconscious came from his theory of opposite wishes, namely that for each repressed wish, there's also an opposite wish in the unconscious that needs to be made conscious. His style was thus an active, didactic one. To quote him, in suitable cases, the patient is first asked to give his free associations to determine the nature of the repressed wish active at that time. He is then ordered to build up wish fulfillments and fantasies with reference to the repressed wish, ultimately taking up the roles of the subject and the object in the wish situation. The patient was further instructed to repeat this at home and to report the resultant fantasies in the next session. Now, one can speculate whether Bose's active instructing analyst is not also influenced by the active guru of Indian meditative procedures, such as Nyasa of Tantra or Yog Nidra of yogic practice, techniques with which Bose was thoroughly familiar. Freud's view of the unconscious as the repository of the repressed is too familiar to all of you, as is his technique of interpreting resistance and defense, free association, transference, dreams, and symptom formation to provide access to the unconscious, of translating into conscious awareness the repressed material that created gaps in the patient's psychic life. One can only add that endearingly, he was human enough not to always follow his own instructions on how the analyst should interact with the patient. He was often, as in the famous Dora case, what many analysts have called a paternalistic pedant who did not listen enough. I had never reflected my own style till this question prodded me to do so. Of course, I subscribe to the unconscious as a repository of repressions and deprivations, but I also believe it is a fount of the healing eros. Though popularly identified with sexuality, eros does not merely coincide with it. It is an intense feeling of being alive, of spontaneity, creativity, and connectivity to both our human and non-human environment. When Freud writes that the power of the id expresses the true purpose of the individual organism's life, I think this can go in that direction. This consists, and he says this consists in the satisfaction of its innate needs, then the flow of eros is an innate need. It is perhaps close to what Winnicott called primitive love, antecedent to Kleinian hate, although Winnicott was, of course, never comfortable with his erotic dimension. For Winnicott, what the analyst needs to do is to provide a holding environment that fosters the natural developmental process of primitive love. I too visualize the analytic process as removing the blockages and inhibitions to the free flow of eros in mind, body, and soul. Insofar as much of contemporary psychoanalysis focus is on attenuating psychic pain, fear, guilt, anxiety, depression, the engagement with loss and mourning, absolutely true, all true, but we often tend to lose sight that the joy of the full flow of eros, ananda, is not a way of avoiding or managing psychic pain, but the moments or periods of freedom from it. There's a famous poem, Fez, by Fez, if I remember correctly, और भी गम है ज़माने में मोहब्बत के सिवाय. So I would adapt it by saying कि psyche के चमन में और भी पौधे हैं loss and mourning के सिवाय. For a post-Freudian, there's a range of available techniques which go beyond Freud, such as some of contemporary emphasis on the analyst's subjectivity in accessing the unconscious of the patient by relying on the analyst's countertransference. This goes even further in the intersubjectivist school, perhaps arising from a strong strain of egalitarianism in American society on analytic transparency and disclosure of the analyst's own subjectivity to the patient. My own personal style favors an unearthing of major, unconscious, repetitive themes in the client's life history through free associations, transference and countertransference, and especially dreams, which are the favorite part of my analytic work. I think I may be interpreting more than I should, but since I appreciate one or other insight of different schools without adhering to any one of them, these are not dogmatic interpretations, which are no more than propaganda. Nevertheless, I need to be constantly aware that I must hold back with my interpretations and not impinge on the client's exploration of her psychic life, remain open to the emergence of the surprising and the unexpected. That my advanced age is no ground to succumb to the seduction of the guru fantasy.
So would you like to tell us a little bit about your work, Mind in the World, and the experience of writing it in today's time? How have you experienced an evolution as a writer in the writing while working on this text? And as you've already introduced it, but perhaps you could elaborate on how it has shifted your reading of Freud and other psychoanalytic thinkers that inspire you.
Okay. Mind in the World is the title of 4 volumes of my collected papers to be published by Oxford University Press, I hope later this year. The 4 volumes, each with a different editor, are Psychoanalysis, Culture and Society, Religion, and Biography. But what I'm working on now is a book of recently published and unpublished essays, a sequel to Culture and Psyche with the tentative title, The Indian Jungle, Essays on Culture and Psychoanalysis. I don't think the work on this book has led to any evolution in me as a writer. Such evolutions would be rather unseemly at my age. It has led to other discoveries though, such as the signal importance of Freud to psychoanalysis as a writer. In other words, if you read Freud as a writer, you discover aspects of his thought which have been, I think, insufficiently appreciated by psychoanalysts. Let me illustrate this with an example. In his The Ego and the Id, Freud observes, and I quote him, "For one gets an impression that the simple Oedipus complex is by no means its commonest form, but rather represents a simplification or schematization which, to be sure, is often enough justified for practical purposes. Closer study usually discloses the more complete Oedipus complex, which is twofold, positive and negative, and is due to the bisexuality originally present in children. That is to say, a boy has not merely an ambivalent attitude toward his father and an affectionate object choice towards his mother, but at the same time, he also behaves like a girl and displays an affectionate feminine attitude to his father and a corresponding jealousy and hostility towards his mother. It is this complicating element introduced by bisexuality that makes it so difficult to obtain a clear view of the facts in connection with the earliest object choices and identifications, and still more difficult to describe them intelligibly. It may even be that the ambivalence displayed in relations to the parents should be attributed entirely to bisexuality, and that it is not, as I have represented above, developed out of identification in consequence of rivalry. Now, this is Freud talking. Now, this is an extraordinary statement. Freud admitting to even the slightest doubt in one of the bedrocks of psychoanalytic canon, the fateful developmental consequences of rivalry with a parent. However, in the subsequent paragraphs, Freud begins to retreat. The commonly known form of Oedipal complex comes to the fore. Now, this is, of course, at par with the literary style of one of the great stylists of his time, as Freud has often been called. So what distinguishes this style? In The Ego and the Id, as in most of his essay, Freud is always lucid as he begins to consider an issue, evidently deliberating, apparently scrupulous, although in the next paragraph, he rakes in with a tiger's leap all that had just been before possible, though by no means assured. I suggest that our reading of The Ego and the Id and Freud generally pay greater attention to Freud considering and deliberating rather than following Freud on the path he finally chooses to take. Another example, again from The Ego and the Id, because that is what is concerning at the moment, which I've been reading, is Freud's statement that, and I again quote, the effects of the first identifications made in earliest childhood will be general and lasting. This leads us back to the origin of the ego ideal, for behind it there lies hidden an individual's first and most important identification, his identification with the father in his own personal prehistory. What goes before this statement, because that we often take as the final one, is in the footnote where he says, perhaps it would be safer to say the identification with the parents. For before a child has arrived at a definite knowledge of the difference between the sexes, the lack of a penis, it does not distinguish in value between its father and its mother. In order to simplify my presentation, I shall discuss only identification with the father. So what I'm suggesting, or what I got as a writer, reading Freud as a writer, that reading Freud's considering, and weighing of different arguments gives us a vastly more nuanced view of Freud's thought than paying attention simply only to the conclusion to which he leaps.
Thank you, sir. Gagan, would you like to present us with the next question?
Yeah, I was just ruminating. That was revelatory, and just a lot of processing was happening. But interestingly, an excerpt from Freud's paper on transience seems particularly pertinent to our conversation today. I would like to read out a quote directly from Freud. These are, in fact, his reflections after a conversation with a poet. Durgesh, if you could put up the image right now so that those who want to read can read along. So I'll start reading. My conversation with the poet took place in the summer before the war. A year later, the war broke out and robbed the world of its beauties. It destroyed not only the beauty of the countrysides through which it passed and the works of art which it met with on its path, but it also shattered our pride in the achievements of our civilization, our admiration for many philosophers and artists, and our hopes of a final triumph over the differences between nations and races. It tarnished the lofty impartiality of our science. It revealed our instincts in all their nakedness and let loose the evil spirits within us, which we thought had been tamed forever by centuries of continuous education by the noblest minds. It made our country small again, made the rest of the world far remote. It robbed us of very much that we had loved, and showed us how ephemeral were many things that we had regarded as changeless. I believe that those who think thus and seem ready to make a permanent renunciation, because what was precious has proved not to be lasting, are simply in a state of mourning for what is lost. When the mourning is over, it will be found that our high opinion of the riches of civilization has lost nothing from our discovery of their fragility. We shall build up again all that war has destroyed, and perhaps on firmer ground and more lastingly than before. I I refer to this quote and I wonder, what do you think has happened to our capacities to hold conversations? Where are we headed as a human race?
What you quoted and showed was a wonderful example of Freud as a writer. It's really greatly appreciated. So what did we mourn during the pandemic as we became isolated in closed spaces, saw daily pictures of people uprooted from their homes and lives, trudging along dusty roads? And today, when the airwaves are full of war and refugees whose habitats have been destroyed and who must seek a new life elsewhere, psychologically, I feel the pandemic has made the outside world seem dangerous and untrustworthy. There's a constant fear of catching the virus, not only from strangers, but also from friends, and even more unsettling, from parents, siblings, spouses, and children, who normally constitute our unconscious envelope of safety, persons to whom we otherwise entrust our well-being without a thought. The virus itself is an uncanny object, all around us, yet invisible, mounting further assault on our sense of basic trust, the trust in the world being a benign place. And we know that this basic trust has its origins in the earliest years of life, from an infant's experience of good enough parenting that makes the outer world at the time essentially consisting of the family, safe and predictable. With a decrease in basic trust and wilting of the plant that grows out of its soil, hope, our collective economy does seem to be in doldrums. Hope is further diminished by the images of death all around us, not only on television screens, but of loved ones and people we knew well. The omnipresence of death dents the fantasy of our own immortality, the unconscious conviction that I will live forever. What many felt during the pandemic and what many continue to feel is a long exile from what I call the erotic field, the land of life-giving and life-promoting forces in which we otherwise spend our lives. It is a feeling of a drying out of the erotic field, a depletion of loving connectedness, a seepage of the life force, which at its extreme is equated with dying and death. The erotic field itself comprises of the person's myriad connections to the not self, both in the inner and outer worlds. We normally equate the not self with human others, including the mental representation in the psyche of loved ones who are no longer alive. Indeed, stable mental representations of loving connectedness within the family while growing up are some of the more vital parts of the erotic field. Yet there are many other human and non-human connections that we barely register and become aware of them only when the connection is lost, as it was for many during the pandemic. Connections that are independent of our material circumstances. A patient who had long waited to migrate to the United States had his wish fulfilled when he got a well-paying job in New York. In spite of a great improvement in his material living conditions, he soon discovered how unhappy the move had made him. It was not only his family and friends that he missed, but the familiar faces he encountered every day on his way to work in Delhi. The sidewalk barber shaving a customer who would nod to him, the recognition in the eyes of the vegetable vendor he passed by, the smile of a child on its way to school, a child he did not personally know. The recognition connecting them was a part of the erotic field, as much as the flowers in the neighbor's garden or the roadside tree with a roughly hewn stone idol of Vishnu leaning against the base of its trunk, marigold petals strewn on and around the idol by passing devotees, where he stopped each morning for a quick bow with his raised hand pressed together in genuflection before continuing on his way to work. But there are some out of this crisis enhanced, rather than impoverished. These are persons whose erotic field is reconfigured and not depleted. Memories of loving connectedness with others, especially the earlier ones with all their intensity, become more plentiful and come to the fore in the inner world, while the non-human connections in the outer world assume a salience that was earlier denied to them. The American poet-philosopher Henry David Thoreau, in his solitary forest retreat, would write that his daily dip in the Walden Pond reminded him of nature's endless capacity to renew life and stir him to higher aspirations. Whenever Rabindranath Tagore felt lonely and depressed, and I quote him, stranded in a desolation where every individual has to struggle through his own problems unaided, he would withdraw into remote countryside and wall himself from any but the most perfunctory human contact. In a reconfiguring of the erotic field, the connection with his surround, the natural environment, assumed an unparalleled awareness. And I quote him here, "My feelings seem to be those of our ancient earth in the daily ecstasy of its sun-kissed life. My own unconscious seems to stream through each blade of grass, each sucking root, to rise with the sap through the trees, to break out with joyous thrills in the waving fields of corn, in the rustling palm leaves. I feel impelled to give expression to my blood tie with the earth, my kinsman love for her, but I'm afraid I shall not be understood." So the drying out of the erotic field in loneliness portends its obliteration in death. Indeed, the fear of death in modern consciousness no longer lies in the dread of punishments in an afterlife, but in the erotic field becoming a dust bowl, an unimaginable loneliness where the self is stripped all connections to our human and non-human world.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for evoking several reveries about solitude in erotic fields and the crushing weight of loneliness, which is interestingly a place where I'd like to introduce a question about groups and about spaces that we share with others. In our discussions, there was a particular question that stood out to you. And if I may, I'd like to read that out. This was submitted by Dr. Ajit Mathur, and he asked us, large groups and group relations are notoriously marked by plenty of craziness beyond awareness of members participating in such groups. So what, in your view, would make an appropriate lens or framework to study this madness?
There have been many lenses to study the destructive behavior of large groups, lenses crafted by history, political science, economics, social psychology. We also have a psychoanalytic lens, whose most prominent representative is Vamik Volkan. The psychoanalytic lens shows us that perhaps the need for enemies is also a part of our developmental heritage. That collective identities, including their darker side, the hate for the other, are anchored deep in our inner world from early on in life. I have tried to study the collective behavior of Hindus and Muslims in my colors of violence, incorporating the different insights of different approaches while privileging, of course, the psychoanalytic one. The urgent task before us, as it always has been, is how to weaken the hold of these darker religious identities that constitute mortal danger to the survival of our country. I find no satisfaction in the pessimistic but not hopeless conclusion on the future of Hindu-Muslim relations, which I reached in The Colors of Violence, which was published in 1996. Today, I would say that in the long run, we need a massive educational effort for our children that openly addresses the issue of the dark side of our collective religious identity, which can be disavowed only at the peril of being then available to demagogues who seek to harness it to the goal of divisiveness and differentiation. This education and empathy will not and cannot be limited to the mere provision of information, but also harness all the resources of art, musical, visual, cinematic, to reach the deeper layers of the psyche where communal identity has its home and which is inaccessible to language alone. In the absence of such an effort, Gandhiji's gloomy diagnosis made almost 100 years ago in 1924 will continue to haunt us far into foreseeable future. He said, "I see no way of achieving anything in this afflicted country without a lasting heart unity between Hindus and Muslims. There is no question more important and more pressing than this. In my opinion, it blocks all progress." So our shadow side is part of our developmental heritage, as I said. And such an education that I'm recommending leads to a realization that our developmental heritage from our childhood is not our fate, that we need not act according to our darker dictates. It is the realization that the heart unity Gandhiji envisages may not be possible for many, but that between loving and hating your neighbor, there's a range of choices, ranging from various shades of amity to indifference that are also available to each of us.
So there's and I think we are segueing into our Q&A right now since it is time. So there's a question submitted by Radhika, who's a counseling psychologist at Sukrut. And she wishes to ask you, how do you think has the dynamics of awareness of historical atrocities, religious politics, and changing worldviews through the lens of social media affected Hindu society? And I think she's carrying her reading of your text, The Inner World, while she asks you this question.
I see. Okay. Okay, the inner world was concerned with identity development in traditional India. So though still embracing the lives of a majority of Hindus, there has been, as your questioner said, rapid social change. So I would address both the continuities and discontinuities between traditional and non-traditional India, the India of urban middle class, of which change in the position of women is the most marked feature. The central message, the importance of Hindu culture in the formation of Indian identity, would remain unchanged, though I would avoid some overgeneralizations. There are some statements, such as the one on Indians having a weak, underdeveloped ego, that I would put in non-pejorative and relativistic terms. It was an embarrassing statement by a young analyst who identified with the classic psychoanalytic tradition that implicitly considered middle-class European man as the norm from which other people growing up in non-Western societies were deviations. So I would now stress, which I did in subsequent work, that context sensitivity and greater access to imagination in the ego development is not a weakness, but a different mode of being in the world, one that is adapted to the culture in which the Hindu child grows up. In other words, the essence of the ego is cultural, and the reality of the reality principle, which the ego endeavors to substitute for the pleasure principle of the id, is essentially cultural. The changes, when you are in them, they look very, very, always, because we are in them, so momentous. But I think we need to remember that family institutions change much more slowly than political and economic and other social institutions. Yes, there are these changes taking place, but there are also continuities which are very much still there.
I'd like to interrupt here for a minute and let our audience know that like Ipsita said, we've segued into the Q&A section, and you're invited to use the raise hand function and send in your questions as if they've just arrived to you in the chat. Otherwise, Ipsita and I both have some questions already on hand, as you all know. You've written them to us in your registration forms, and we will be addressing those as we go along. Thank you. Ipsita, you want to take it up from here?
Sure. So I think that this is a question that seems to maintain a continuity with what you've been talking about. And it asks, in a country like India, where the general insight for a self is low and a lot of taboo around sex, how do we practice teachings of Freud in such a climate?
Could you repeat the question, Sari?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, in a country like India, I heard, and where there's a taboo.
Where the general insight for self is low and a lot of taboo exists around sex, how do we practice teachings of Freud in such a climate?
This was a question which I asked myself in 1975 when I started the practice also. At that time, these taboos were much, much stronger. I think, but we make a mistake when we think that a turn into the introspective turn, or the turn into looking into oneself, is low in India. It is low in the Freudian sense, yes. It is low in the Freudian sense, in the sense of that the introspection, the turn inwards, is looked at as a biographical turn. What was your biography like? Whereas your childhood becomes very important. That, you are quite right, is not seen as, for people who don't know about psychoanalysis, as what is this, what for? I don't want to know all that. You tell me something. But people are ready to turn inwards. If you, for instance, well, it used to be in 75, I'm sure it has changed very much. And especially in the urban middle class, who now read about psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic and in help or newspapers, it's almost everywhere in movies, they know what it is, but we are talking about ones who don't. My used to be that whenever patients, when they started and said, this is what happened, I felt so bad, always to ask, when did you feel that earlier too? So it was slowly through these questions, turning the patient or the client towards the Freudian, what is interested is the early childhood and the biographical turn into life. So that was certainly one of the ways to do it, of asking. And I didn't find people who were completely what you would imagine non-English speaking, completely ready to do that. The only difference, there were two kinds of people, or there are still two kinds of people. One who believe that my psychic turmoil, suffering comes from inside. And that is very much a Hindu thing also. The five guna, the calm, krodh, lobh, it's very much a psychoanalytic sense. Freud has, we'll say, krodh and calm, mostly aggression when you look at it, but so they believe it comes from inside. So those people are very much okay for psychoanalysis, even if they don't know about Freud. The others, of course, believe that it comes from outside. I'm possessed. My suffering is due to jinn, bhoot, possession by spirits, exorcism. Those are very difficult those are not really suitable for the psychoanalytic one. But the psychologically minded Indians don't have to be Freudian psychological minded to be able to benefit from Freudian analysis.
Thank you, sir. So you mentioned कि mourning or melancholia के अलावा और भी पौधे हैं. There are other plants in the field than just mourning and melancholia. And we have a question submitted to us by our very own Durgesh. And he asks that he'd like to know how to keep hope alive in these times when the death instincts of the people are being exploited to do harm to the fellow human, to earth, and to our environment. How do we keep hope alive in our personal lives and perhaps also in the clinic?
I think I did answer that question when I was talking about hope, which is wilted, as the questioner is saying in our way, uh, of, uh, of the erotic field, a reinvigoration of the erotic field, and to look at that not only with people, personal. And then one would be surprised of how many connections, outside connection to the not human, also start giving one's, or let me put it, greening the erotic field and thus giving water to the plant of hope. So hope is not just connection to the human, which weighs, of course, which weighs the most on us, also the human depredations, degradations, terrors that weigh most on us, but to look also to the non-human, the outside. And then again, the same thing. And well, I don't think I need to repeat what I did say at that time, but this would be mine. That hope, of course, is the sheet anchor. I mean, without hope, there can be nothing. So there can be no analytic analysis. There can be no.
Building on what you just said, Professor Kakar, this is a question submitted by a colleague, Rohan Rasher, and I think it's relevant for therapists who found themselves suddenly in the blink of an eye thrust into a clinic which was just them in a room. It was just
Sorry, which
was just them in a room with a screen.
Oh, with the screen. Yeah.
Thinking in the context of the clinic and the crisis, the pandemic, the politics of different countries playing out, elections and war. When the body of the other is not in the same physical space of the clinic, in the same context of the nation, but in a square box, teletherapy. Then that is two-dimensional. So what gets created and what gets lost?
Okay. I think this was one of the Freudian principles which has never really been questioned by any school, that the analyst use of her own unconscious in apprehending the unconscious of the patient. This is what the analyst does or tries to do, of that if you want to apprehend the unconscious of others, you do it through the use of your own unconscious. And that, and then Freud recommended the rule of surrender himself to his own unconscious mental activity, state of evenly suspended attention, as far as possible, avoid the construction of conscious expectations. I mean, memory and desire of beyond go have, like everything in psychoanalysis, all go back to Freud somewhere. And so by these means, catch the drift of the patient's unconscious. Now, how do Zoom or Skype experiences change that? Not substantially, since language is the most important factor still in the understanding of the unconscious in psychoanalysis. And that is still available in the screen. But the full presence of the patient is more than her words or her image on the screen. So even if we are not aware of it, in the personal setting, unconscious information is being received not only through what is being said through words or what we can look at, but through subliminal exchanges of smells, body heat, muscle tension, and body rhythm. And these are absent in the screen digital mode, which can be considered as the best available substitute, but not one, at least I mean, these are, of course, all of these are my opinions only, but not one that can fully replace the personal setting.
So we have another question about classical psychoanalytic notions, and this was a question that was submitted by Professor Barnaby Barrett. And he asks if, in your opinion, there is a connection between the tantric or yogic notions of subtle energy, and what would that be?
Uh-huh. I mean, starting superficially, of course, both talk of an energy that is based in the body, and both identify parts of the body where the energy is particularly active and consequential. I think this is where the similarity ends. In Tantra, the energy may be based in the body and need the body for its purpose, but the nature of the energy is spiritual. And its aim is also spiritual enlightenment through a union of the individual body-based energy with a universal energy pervading the universe. The process is an orderly procession from the anal zone through the stomach, heart, eyes, forehead to the top of the head. Freud's libidinal energy is not a careful cultivation, but is like a storm, a visitation on the erogenous zones of the mouth and the anus, and then the genitals, making demands on the infant's emerging mind to deal with it. So both are, although they may look a similarity in the beginning, are quite different things.
I'd like to remind the participants that we have another 15 minutes. So if there's any question that you'd like to ask at the moment, please use your raise your hand in the function and let us know, and we'd love to invite you into the conversation. Meanwhile, sir, we have a question from Pankuri, who's a psychotherapist from AIMS, and she asks, I'm wondering if there's a place for the concept of shunya in psychoanalysis and what that would look like. I'm also curious to understand the place of the community in psychoanalysis and in psychoanalytic therapy.
Place of, sorry, community
In psychoanalysis and in therapy.
The difficulty would be that I don't see the place for the shunya in psychoanalysis. If there is a place, it is only after the psychoanalysis has ended. If all the inhibitions, problems, issues, psychological issues have been nothing can be completely always resolved, but have left a place for other things to enter this. And the shunya is to me a spiritual concept. So I think it is really the master's program, but after the psychoanalytic bachelor's program has ended, I don't think also that unless you are a very rare kind of a mystic, that you can go to those kind of states without a cleansing, at least, of the psyche through the, well, psychoanalytic of all kinds. I'm not only Freudian, there are other psychoanalytic ones also, cleansing of that. A place of community, or well, community, of course, I mean, community is always in the mind. We grow up in communities. So mental representation, I think I said at the beginning, of the community, which means the fantasies of the community, of what they believe, what they are, how they look at children. communities is always a part of the formation, goes into the formation of the psyche, together with your individual experiences in the family and your body, mental representations of the family and of the body.
Thank you, sir. I think you've answered all the questions that we had collected. So I'd like to once again invite the people in the room. If there are any questions that you'd like to ask Professor Kakar, now is your shining moment.
I think Loretta wants to say something. Durgesh could, yeah.
Hi, Professor Kakar. It's such an honor to speak with you. I'm very honored. I have your collection here, and wanted to ask you about a line in your clinical work in cultural imagination from 1997. You say here, in a fundamental sense, psychoanalysis does not have a cross-cultural context, but takes place in the same culture across different societies. It works in the established and expanding enclaves of psychological modernity around the world. And in this time, several decades later, many are either bemoaning or celebrating the decline of modernity. And I'm wondering if you can share thoughts you may have about psychoanalysis and cultural imperialism. I'm speaking to you from the United States, and psychoanalysis as a cultural practice that shapes psychic life around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Well, I think this is still true. There are, of course, psychoanalysts going, they become much more sensitive to that. There are other places than the modernized Western, or what are called the weird people, Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. That is the place from where psychoanalysts come, and that is where their patients are and where their teachers are. So, and I think they recognize that also much more. There are going to the inner cities, wanting to go to different cultures. But I think because of the the emphasis on language in psychoanalysis is so strong, and language is becomes very, very difficult to get out of these kind of people who are wordy, which are who are most in 1996 or whenever I wrote that, the patients which I saw, and then when I used to talk to people in United States or colleagues, they were similar. They were children of academics, doctors, professional classes, journalists, advertising, entrepreneurs. So mostly those kind of people who went for psychoanalysis. It was a self-perpetuating one. But I think psychoanalysts have become much more humble, or at least I would like to hope so, since those times. And in fact, if one compares psychoanalysis to many others, some of the psychiatry or the themes, they are becoming much more humble and not so imperialistic as they once were. But you are right, I agree. I mean, that is why in my conversation with Freud, he admitted that, well, we were imperialistic because we grew up in imperialistic times. We had no other except being imperial. Nobody told us that you were imperial. It was as the times were. And I wish, and that was one of my wish, that we have much more from non-Western cultures coming out. It would be not for the non-Western cultures, but very good for psychoanalysis to let go of some of the what taken for granted that is a psychoanalytic verity. And that's where I was recommending that reading Freud closely, and not only for the conclusion. You see, he has all of them. Look at him saying about bisexuality. He's very much saying this is the most important part, and it's one of his most important papers. Afterwards, he says it isn't. And bisexuality is in the imperial part. I remember in India, in the first British psychoanalysts who were there were writing papers in the International Journal of all Indian being completely feminized, bisexual, terrible. It was looked upon as an illness. In fact, till almost the 1980s, homosexuality, the biggest, the most well-known psychoanalyst was an illness. It was very much an illness. But psychoanalysts do learn, and I hope we will continue learning.
That was a very thought-provoking response, Professor Kakar. We have Professor Nagpal with us who has a question. And I would request Professor Nagpal to unmute himself and ask.
And Professor Nagpal's, as it should be, would be the last question, because we would hear after time.
That's absolutely true. We're running out of time.
Yeah.
Dear Ashok, yes.
Yes, thanks, Sudhir. I mean, this is a remarkable meeting virtually in an initiative taken by Shalini and team. The only place where I feel you let the difficulty of the times get represented through is the image of demagogue. That how the demagogues can exploit things if you don't wake up in time to bring it, etc., etc. And at least 9 times I noted, because I want to imbibe this quality, that whenever you refer to past writing, past thinking, you manage to create a slice there to say there was an excess there was an exaggeration there, or there was something that I could have caught only that well or that little. So the question is that, does the analyst get affected? Analyst like you, who is so aware and who's constantly revising and thus being reborn, I feel, is he affected by moments when the leading political thinking is almost saying we are waiting for pogroms?
We are waiting for?
Pogrom. This is Pratap Bhanu Mehta, I think 3 weeks back, writing that this is what we are left with. Just a pogrom is to be awaited. So how do you?
Well, of course, an analyst is an analyst only when he is in the analytic room doing the analysis. Just like a poet is a poet when writing poetry, or a mystic is a mystic when he's getting the mystic. Otherwise, we are all citizens the same way, affected by all these much, of course. The thing is, what then one thinks about it. So the analytic thinking, not analytic thinking, but mine would be, I would look at it from the analytic, not only in a hopeful way that this shall also pass, bahut chale gaye, bahut gaye, but not only that, but what is it that is creating that? And then would be that, and here I would go back actually to Weber here, that of charisma, that he didn't place it in the leaders who are those kind of autocrats or encouraging program. His second for charisma was extraordinary human needs, that it is the motivations, interacting of the motivations of the leadership of whatever kind, political, religious, etc., but also of the followers. And that is then social unrest, economic dissatisfaction, national disgrace, persecution, military threat or defeat. And that is the times people are more prone to gather around, and who then says this is the way, whether it's pogrom or not, and that is the one you are going to follow. So it is that how have we become so helpless? Is it only the economic and political things which are going on? How have we become so feeling of that we need to then reverse this feeling of helplessness by the idealization of the whoever the leader? You are great, but I'm a part of you. So that you create a psychic integration yourself. The solution, of course, it can't. The solution won't be implemented. Was my suggestion of that. And that education and empathy starts in the first grade. You have a period hours. There are two things which I would greatly recommend for our collective mental health, but which of course would never be taken up, or are two subjects taught very differently. One is relationships, and the second is empathy. And both, as I said, need information is not going to have, you have it in have small groups, you have movies, teaching, etc. Now, what more can one do?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kakar.
Thank you.
It's been such a delight to hear from you, and no amount of time could seem enough. But we have arrived at the end of this conversation, which I hope would be one of many. I would like to invite Dr. Shalini Masih to give you a vote of thanks on behalf of Team Shades.
Hi, Professor Kakar. Hello, everyone. Well, I feel the hallmark of any psychoanalytic space is that it leaves the mind expanded, and past 1 hour or 20 minutes or so have done just that. So my mind feels like a field where now more flowers, or there's possibility of more plants to bloom than just mourning and melancholia and loss. But also, I think I also want to say that we are a very small group, so the turnout is overwhelming. We're trying to do something very different and trying to do it very differently. We put fierce love and care in how we organize an event and imagine it. And I cannot thank you enough for agreeing to do this, Professor Kakar. Thank you so much. And thank you all the participants who turn up and for this event. There'll be more events in future, and we'll keep you posted. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Shalini, and thank you very much your team and the participants who've come in, and thank you for inviting me, because it also actually gave me a chance for the first time to talk on the clinical stuff much more, which
yes.
I've been talking of other things much more. So that was actually good for me. And thank you.
As it was for us. Thank you so much. Until we meet again.
Thank you, sir.
Inshallah.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Professor Kakar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Looks like people want